The stone floor of the Basilica di Santa Maria sopra Minerva was still warm from the day's heat when Cardinal Antonio Barberini pressed his trembling hand against it, feeling for the seam. August in Rome, 1633. The air thick enough to drown in. Outside, the Eternal City slept, or pretended to. Inside this Dominican church, built upon the ruins of a pagan temple to wisdom, 3 men prepared to commit acts so profane that every record of what transpired would be systematically hunted down and destroyed. But erasure is never complete. The cardinal's fingers found what they sought, a groove in the marble, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Beneath this church, beneath the bones of saints and the prayers of centuries, lay a chamber that predated Christianity itself. And tonight, in that ancient hollow carved by hands that worshipped different gods, the faithful would perform a ceremony that married the sacred to the obscene in ways that would make the Inquisition itself recoil. One witness survived. His testimony, hidden in a papal archive that wouldn't be opened for 300 years, contains words that scholars still refuse to translate in full. This is that story, the one the Vatican tried to erase. If you crave more forbidden history, more buried truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past, follow this channel. Some stories are meant to stay hidden. We disagree. The year 1633 was a wound in the Catholic Church's side that refused to close. 2 months earlier, Galilei had been forced to his knees in the very same church where Cardinal Barberini now stood, compelled to renounce his claim that the earth moved around the sun. The astronomer had wept, not from fear, witnesses said, but from rage at being made to lie. The church had won that battle, but the price was higher than anyone in the papal court would admit. Cracks were spreading through the foundation of ecclesiastical authority, hairline fractures that would, in time, shatter the medieval world. Cardinal Antonio Barberini understood this better than most. Nephew to Pope Urban VIII, he moved through the Vatican's corridors of power with the ease of someone born to them. At 36, he possessed a face that seemed carved from the same Carrara marble as Michelangelo's Pietà, beautiful, cold, and entirely unreadable. But tonight, as he stood in the empty church with sweat darkening his scarlet cassock, his composure was cracking. "Are you certain he'll come?" The voice belonged to Father Tommaso Campanella, a Dominican friar whose reputation for philosophy was matched only by his infamy for heresy. He had spent 27 years in the prisons of the Spanish Inquisition, tortured repeatedly, and emerged with his mind intact, but twisted into shapes that disturbed even his supporters. He was 75 years old, bent and broken, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made younger men look away. "He'll come," Barberini replied, though his voice carried no conviction. "He has no choice, not after what we've promised him." The third figure emerged from the sacristy, like something conjured from shadow. Athanasius Kircher, Jesuit polymath, linguist, inventor, and scholar of such staggering breadth that he was called the last man who might know everything. At 31, he was the youngest among them, and perhaps the most dangerous. Kircher believed that all knowledge was connected, that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and Christian scripture and the movements of the stars spoke a single cosmic language. He had come to Rome that very year, fleeing war-torn Germany with manuscripts that church censors had already condemned. "The door," Kircher said, his German accent turning the Latin words harsh. "It's opening." They turned as one. The church's side entrance, barely visible in the gloom, swung inward on hinges that hadn't been oiled, deliberately. The squeal of metal on metal echoed through the nave like a scream. The man who entered wore the simple brown robes of a Franciscan, but there was nothing simple about him. Even in darkness, even stooped with age and defeat, Galilei commanded the space around him like a field of gravity. He was 70 years old, nearly blind, condemned to house arrest for the remainder of his life for the crime of being right. The church had broken him publicly, but as he approached the three men waiting in the shadows, none of them doubted they were in the presence of something unbroken. "You promised me the stars," Galileo said, his voice a rasp. "Show me." Act 2. The Descent. Cardinal Barberini knelt, his fingers working at the hidden mechanism in the floor. The marble slab, 6 feet square, carved with the symbol of an eye inside a triangle, shifted with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth's bowels. Beneath it, stairs descended into absolute darkness. "The Mithraic chamber," Kircher whispered, something like reverence in his voice. 2nd century, perhaps earlier. When this was still a temple to Minerva, Roman soldiers worshipped here in secret. The cult of Mithras, the sun god, the slayer of the cosmic bull. Blood sacrifice and initiation rites that Rome's official religion condemned as barbaric. "How wonderfully ironic," Galileo murmured, "that we now hide beneath a church built to suppress such things." They descended single file, Campanella leading with a torch that threw their shadows enormous against the walls. The air changed as they went deeper, cooler but heavy with moisture and something else, something that made the back of the throat tighten. The smell of old stone, yes, but also incense from ceremonies held here when Rome was young, when men cut the throats of bulls and bathed in their blood to be reborn. The chamber at the bottom was larger than any of them expected, the ceiling vaulted 15 feet overhead, carved with images of stars and constellations that predated Ptolemy. In the center of the room stood an altar, not Christian, though someone had tried to Christianize it by carving a crude cross into its surface. The cross had been chiseled away recently, leaving only a scar. Around the altar, 7 columns rose from the floor, each carved with zodiacal symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. On the altar lay 3 objects, arranged with ceremonial precision. The first was a book, its covers bound in leather so old it had turned black and cracked like scorched skin. No title marked it, but Kircher approached it with the caution of a man approaching a sleeping serpent. "The Clavicula Salomonis," he breathed. "The Key of Solomon." "I thought every copy had been burned." "Not every copy," Barberini said. "Some secrets are too valuable to destroy completely. This one was in the papal library, misfiled deliberately as a ledger of grain taxes from 1347. The grimoire, for that's what it was, a manual of ceremonial magic and demon summoning that the church had condemned for 800 years, seemed to pulse in the torchlight. Its pages, Galileo could see even with his failing eyes, were covered in scripts that flowed between Hebrew and Latin, and languages that might have been made up or might have been older than both. The second object was a reliquary, gold and crystal, containing what appeared to be fragments of bone. "St. Dominic," Campanella said, his voice hollow. "The founder of our order. His finger bones taken from his tomb in Bologna without permission or blessing. Stolen, to be precise." "Not stolen," Barberini corrected. "Borrowed. We'll return them." "After we defile them," Campanella added bitterly. The third object made even Galileo, who claimed to believe in nothing but mathematics and observation, take a step backward. It was a mirror, or something like a mirror. The frame was obsidian, volcanic glass polished to impossible smoothness, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The reflecting surface didn't show the room around them. Instead, it showed stars. Not the stars visible from Rome in August 1633, but stars in configurations that shouldn't exist. Constellations that Galileo had never observed through his telescope. "What in God's name?" he began. "That's precisely the question we're here to answer," Kircher interrupted. "What is in God's name? And what exists outside it?" Cardinal Barberini opened the grimoire with hands that shook despite his efforts at control. The pages crackled as he turned them, each one threatening to crumble into dust. He found what he sought 2/3 through, a ritual of invocation written in 3 columns, Latin, Hebrew, and a script that looked like no earthly language. "The ritual requires blood," he said, not looking up. "Of course it does," Galileo muttered. "They always do." Kircher produced a knife, small, silver, its blade inscribed with words from the Psalms inverted. Upside-down scripture, a mockery that made Campanella cross himself reflexively, then stop, remembering where they were and what they were about to do. Barberini held out his left hand. Kircher cut the palm in a single swift motion, deep enough that blood welled immediately, dripping onto the altar in a rhythm like a second heartbeat. "In nomine Luciferi," Barberini began, his voice steady despite the pain. "In nomine Belial, in nomine Leviathan, in nomine Satanas," the names of demons, of the fallen, of things that Scripture said God had cast into outer darkness. To speak them in ritual context wasn't just heresy, it was an active invitation. The air in the chamber changed. The torch flames bent horizontal, pointing toward the center of the room, even though no wind blew. Campanella, his voice cracking with age and something else, joined the invocation. "We who stand between heaven and earth, we who know the measurements of God's creation, we who have touched the forbidden, we call upon the powers that dwell in the spaces between stars." This was the first unspeakable act. High-ranking members of the Catholic Church, including a cardinal who could theoretically become pope, deliberately invoking demons by name in a ritual of black magic. But they weren't finished. Galileo, who had remained silent, watching with the detached interest of a natural philosopher observing an experiment, suddenly spoke. "You promised me the stars. Show me what you've called." The obsidian mirror began to glow. Not with light, with its opposite, a darkness so absolute it seemed to draw in the surrounding shadows and grow fat on them. The stars visible in its surface began to move, wheeling in patterns that defied the laws of celestial mechanics Galileo had spent his life documenting. And then, impossibly, something looked back. What appeared in the mirror's depths defied easy description. The witness who survived, a young Dominican novice named Brother Marcello, hidden in an alcove and paralyzed with terror, would later write that it was a geometry made flesh, angles that turned inward upon themselves in ways that hurt the mind to perceive. He would spend 3 months in silence after that night, unable to speak without screaming. Kircher stepped forward, his face illuminated by the anti-light emanating from the mirror. "You understand our request?" The thing in the mirror didn't speak in words. Instead, images flooded their minds. Visions of the cosmos as it truly was, not the neat spheres and crystalline orbits the Church taught, but a vast mechanical chaos where worlds were born and died in violence, where humanity was less than dust, where God, if he existed, was either absent or so alien that his will was indistinguishable from random chance. Galileo gasped, his hands clutching at his chest. He was seeing what he had always suspected but never dared to fully believe. Proof that the universe was infinite, that the sun was merely one of countless suns, that the earth was an insignificant speck in a cosmos so large that human significance evaporated like morning dew. "The price?" The presence communicated, not in words but in understanding that bloomed like dark flowers in their minds. The price. This was the second unspeakable act. Campanella lifted the reliquary containing St. Dominic's finger bones. With trembling hands, he opened it and removed the fragments, small pieces of a holy man, a founder of religious orders, bones that had performed miracles according to the faithful. He dropped them into the pool of Barberini's blood gathering on the altar. The bones dissolved, not slowly but instantaneously, like sugar in hot water. The blood turned black, then began to steam, rising in tendrils that formed shapes in the air. Spirals, helices, patterns that looked almost like genetic code centuries before such a concept would exist. By this desecration, Campanella intoned, his voice breaking, "We trade the sacred for the true. We exchange the comfort of faith for the cold certainty of knowledge. May God forgive us." But even as he spoke the words, none of them believed forgiveness was possible for what they were doing. They had taken the remains of a saint and used them as fuel for a ritual of dark summoning. It was a blasphemy so profound that merely describing it would be enough to see them burned. The presence in the mirror seemed to solidify, becoming more present. The chamber grew colder. Frost began to form on the ancient stone walls, spreading in fractal patterns that looked almost like writing. "One more," it communicated. "The compact requires one more sacrifice." Galileo understood before the others. His face, already pale, went the color of old parchment. "No. You promised me knowledge, not—" "Knowledge has a price," Kircher said, and there was genuine regret in his voice, but also an iron determination that explained how he'd survived wars and plagues and the collapse of empires. "You knew this when you came. We all knew." The third and most unspeakable act, the sacrifice of innocence itself. From beneath his robes, Barberini produced a bundle wrapped in silk. He unfolded it slowly, revealing what lay within. A child's dress, white linen embroidered with flowers. It was small, sized for a girl of perhaps 5 or 6 years, and it was stained with blood, not fresh, but not ancient either. Blood from perhaps 3 days earlier. "Maria Giulietta Barberini," the cardinal said, his voice empty of all emotion, as flat as a desert. "My brother's daughter. She died of fever on the Feast of the Assumption. We told the family we would bury her in the family crypt with full honors." "Where is she?" Galileo demanded, horror finally cracking through his intellectual detachment. "Here," Barberini replied, and pointed to a corner of the chamber they had not examined closely. A bundle of cloth, small and pathetically still. The truth crashed over them like a physical wave. They had brought a child's corpse into this pagan temple, into this place of dark ritual. A baptized Christian child, dead of natural causes, but kept from consecrated burial to serve as the final component of their ceremony. "She gave her life unwillingly," Campanella said, and he was weeping now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his withered face. "She knew nothing of our purpose. That is the requirement. Innocent blood shed without knowledge of its purpose. The grimoire is explicit." Kircher, his hands steady despite the monstrousness of what he did, took the child's dress and laid it across the altar where the blood and dissolved saint's bones had created a dark pool. The fabric absorbed the liquid instantly, turning from white to deepest black. "By this," Kircher intoned, reading from the grimoire, "we complete the triangle, the living willingly given, the holy profaned, the innocent sacrificed. 3 acts that cannot be undone. 3 violations that open the door between what is and what is not." The obsidian mirror exploded outward, not with physical force, but with presence. The entity they had been communing with poured into the chamber like water through a shattered dam. Brother Marcello, watching from his hidden alcove, would later write that it was as if all the darkness in the world had been given shape and purpose and hunger. But they got what they bargained for. Knowledge flooded into Galileo's failing mind with such force that he fell to his knees, crying out. He saw the structure of the cosmos laid bare, not just the movement of planets, but the fundamental laws that governed reality itself. Gravity as a curvature of space, light as both wave and particle, time as something relative, malleable, the atom split open to reveal smaller worlds within, stars collapsing into points of infinite density, the universe expanding from a single point of origin billions of years before Genesis claimed creation began. He saw too far. That was the price. The knowledge was genuine. Everything the entity showed him was true, verifiable, the foundation of physics that wouldn't be discovered for 300 years. But the human mind, even Galileo's brilliant mind, wasn't meant to contain such truth all at once. He screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of comprehension, the sound a man makes when he finally, truly understands how small he is. When the papal guards found them 3 hours later, alerted by Brother Marcello, who had finally found the courage to flee and seek help, The scene in the Mithraic chamber was one that would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives. Galileo lay unconscious before the altar, his eyes moving beneath closed lids as if watching visions no one else could see. He would wake, but he would never be the same. His last years consumed by work on mechanics and mathematics, refusing to ever again discuss cosmology or the nature of the heavens. Cardinal Barberini sat with his back against one of the zodiacal columns, staring at nothing, his cut hand still bleeding sluggishly. He would resign his cardinalate within a month, citing health concerns. He would never again appear at papal functions, would die in obscurity in 1671, his name carefully excised from most family records. Father Campanella was found praying in Latin so ancient that even the church scholars couldn't identify the rite. He would return to his cell, would die within a year, his final words recorded as, "The light was false, but the darkness was true." Athanasius Kircher stood before the obsidian mirror, which now showed only the reflection of the chamber. Nothing more, nothing less. But he was smiling. Of the four, only he seemed unbroken. He would go on to publish 40 books, become one of the most celebrated scholars in Europe, fill museums with wonders. And in none of his extensive writings would he ever mention the night of August 17th, 1633. The child's body was quietly buried in the Barberini family crypt, with a story concocted about confusion in the funeral arrangements. The reliquary was returned to Bologna, its contents replaced with chicken bones that no one would examine too closely. The grimoire disappeared into the Vatican archives, misfiled again as something innocuous. The chamber itself was sealed. 3 cartloads of stone were brought in to fill the entrance, and a new floor was laid in the Basilica di Santa Maria sopra Minerva. To this day, tourists walk over that spot, unaware of what lies beneath their feet. But most importantly, every record of what transpired was hunted down and destroyed. Orders went out from the highest levels of the papal court. Anyone found discussing the ceremony would face immediate excommunication and worse. Brother Marcello's testimony was sealed, marked to be opened only after 3 centuries had passed. It remained sealed until 1933, exactly 300 years later. A junior archivist named Father Giuseppe Rossi opened the file out of curiosity on the anniversary date. He read 3 pages before requesting emergency leave. He never returned to the priesthood. The Vatican's official position is that Brother Marcello was mentally unwell, that his testimony describes nothing but fever dreams and paranoia. They point out that there is no corroborating evidence. All the other principals took the secret to their graves. But small facts remain, threads that connect across centuries. Galileo's writings from after August 1633 show a marked change. He stops speculating about the infinite universe. He focuses only on what can be measured, observed, proven without doubt, as if something had shown him truths he desperately wished to unsee. Cardinal Barberini's resignation came without explanation, unusual for a man of his political importance and family connections. Campanella's final work, De Sensu Rerum et Magia, published posthumously, contains passages about doorways in the mind and knowledge that consumes that make no sense in the context of his other philosophy. And Kircher, brilliant, prolific Kircher, left behind a private journal discovered in 1948 when his papers were finally catalogued completely. One entry, from August 18, 1633, reads simply, "We paid the price. The door opened. God help us, we were right. And that is the worst possible truth." The Basilica di Santa Maria sopra Minerva stands to this day, beautiful and serene, one of Rome's lesser-known treasures. Tourists come to see Michelangelo's statue of Christ bearing the cross. They photograph the colorful ceiling frescoes. They walk over the floor where Cardinal Barberini opened the hidden door, never knowing. But sometimes, on August nights when the heat lies heavy on the city, the guards who work the overnight shift report strange sounds from deep beneath the church. Not voices, nothing so definite, more like breathing, or the sound of something vast turning over in sleep. The church maintains its silence. The archives remain sealed, accessible only to scholars with the highest clearances, and even then, only under supervision. When researchers request access to files from 1633, they are steered toward Galileo's trial, toward safe historical ground. Because some ceremonies once performed cannot be undone. Some doors once opened never fully close. Some prices once paid continue collecting interest across the centuries. 3 men went down into that pre-Christian chamber seeking forbidden knowledge. What they found was true. Verifiably, scientifically true in ways that would revolutionize human understanding. But truth, when purchased with such currency, carries its own curse. They invoked powers they didn't fully understand using rituals they believed they controlled. They desecrated the sacred, sacrificed the innocent, and opened pathways between realities that were meant to stay separate. And in doing so, they proved something the Church had always feared, that the universe is far stranger and more terrible than any theology admits, that knowledge without wisdom is a poison, and that some questions are better left unanswered. The ceremony the Vatican tried to erase happened. The evidence was destroyed, the witnesses silenced, the participants erased from history or carefully edited. But erasure is never complete. The truth remains, buried beneath stone and silence and 3 centuries of institutional denial. One night, 3 unspeakable acts, and consequences that echo still in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover. The question is not whether it happened. The evidence, fragmentary and suppressed though it may be, points toward a truth the Church cannot wholly bury. The question is what else remains hidden, what other ceremonies were performed in darkness, what other prices were paid in blood and innocence and the souls of men who sought to know too much. The Vatican keeps its secrets. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface. Some truths demand to be known, no matter the cost. And some costs are so high that knowing them changes what truth means. In the end, that may have been the real ceremony. Not the ritual itself, but the transformation it wrought in the men who participated. They went down as believers in an ordered universe where God's will was paramount and human knowledge had limits. They came back having seen beyond those limits, having touched something that made mockery of comfortable certainties. Cardinal Barberini lost his faith. Campanella found only despair in his. Galileo abandoned the questions that had defined his life. And Kircher learned to smile at the darkness and carry on as if nothing had changed. Which of them paid the highest price? The ones who broke, or the one who didn't? The answer, perhaps, lies sealed in those archives, in Brother Marcello's testimony that no living scholar has been allowed to fully examine. Or perhaps it lies in the chamber itself, beneath the church, waiting in the darkness for another cardinal with another set of desperate questions. The ceremony cannot be undone. The door was opened. And somewhere, in the spaces between faith and knowledge, between what is permitted and what is possible, the consequences of that August night continue to unfold. The Vatican tried to erase it, but you can't erase the darkness by refusing to speak its name. You can only pretend it isn't there, waiting, watching, breathing, beneath the floor of a church built on the ruins of a pagan temple, in a city that has seen empires rise and fall and rise again. 3 unspeakable acts, one night, and a truth that even 3 centuries of silence cannot wholly bury. Some histories refuse to die. This is one of them. The story ends here, but the silence that follows, that's where the real horror begins.